On the morning of December 11th, 2025, in Nashville, Tennessee, the state carried out the execution of 64-year-old Harold Wayne Nichols by lethal injection. He had spent nearly 36 years under sentence of death for a crime that shattered a family, a community, and rippled through the lives of many others. By the time that injection was administered, time had not dulled either memory or consequence. Decades had passed, but the pain of what happened in the fall of 1988 still echoed, in quiet mornings, in anniversaries unmarked, in the unresolved grief of those left behind. This is a story that spans generations of waiting, legal fights, remorse denied, and a journey from violent crime to the final pronouncement of death by the state. It begins with a young woman full of promise. It ends with a man accepting a fate forged by legal judgment, public debate, and the long shadow of his own choices. If you want depth, not headlines, in your true crime stories, subscribe now and stay with me. Because this is a case that forces us to confront not just what happened, but why. Harold Wayne Nichols was not a name known beyond the boundaries of Hamilton County, Tennessee, until the grim details of a brutal killing made him infamous. Born and raised in a part of the country where families know each other by generations, Nichols' early life was not marked by notoriety. But in adulthood, patterns began to take shape. In the late 1980s, Nichols lived a life that outwardly appeared stable. He had relationships, employment, and community ties. Yet beneath that facade was a darkness that few saw until it exploded into violence. Law enforcement records show that Nichols had prior convictions for aggravated rape in Hamilton County in the months surrounding the crime that would lead to his death sentence. These earlier attacks, multiple violent rapes against women in the Chattanooga area, were alarming, but they did not immediately bring Nichols into permanent confinement. Instead, they were warnings that, at the time, remained only partially heeded. As the legal system worked through individual charges for those earlier crimes, another incident would occur that forced a final reckoning. On the night of September 30th, 1988, 20-year-old Karen Pulley was inside her home in Chattanooga. A student at Chattanooga State Community College, she was youthful, ambitious, and looking toward a future that should have been long and ordinary. Instead, her final hours became a nightmare. Nichols broke into her home, approached her as she slept, and brutally assaulted her. After that attack, she was found later with horrendous injuries, the result of a violent and prolonged attack that went beyond a single moment of rage. According to accounts from the time, she was beaten, raped, and left to fight for her life. She was discovered in her house, gravely injured, and rushed to a hospital. One person's tomorrow was erased. One family's world was shattered. One community's sense of safety was violated. Her life was not just taken, it was stolen in its most vulnerable moment. The assault that left Karen Pulley a shell of who she had been was more than just a random tragedy. In the months before her death, Nichols had been implicated in a series of violent rapes. Investigators later connected him to multiple attacks on women in the Chattanooga area between late 1988 and early 1989. But it was the murder of Pulley that triggered the full force of the justice system. Police found ties between Nichols and the scene of the crime. His prior rapes, his proximity to multiple victims, and physical evidence secured during the investigation pointed inexorably to him. Before the full weight of the law closed in, Nichols confessed not only to Pulley's murder, but also to several other rapes he had carried out during that period. This confession was not a fleeting moment of panic. It was an admission of responsibility for a series of violent acts that had terrorized women in the community and upended families. At trial, this admission would be both a burden and a defining moment. Nichols' arrest came swiftly after investigators linked him to Pulley's murder. With his confession and corroborating evidence from multiple sources, prosecutors constructed a case that left little room for misunderstanding. In 1990, he stood before a jury and entered a plea of guilty to first-degree felony murder in the killing of Karen Pulley. But the plea did not spare him punishment. Instead, it became the foundation of a sentencing phase that would determine whether his fate would end in prison or in a death chamber. The jury was presented with aggravating factors: including Nichols' prior convictions for aggravated rape and the horrific nature of the pulley murder, which occurred in the commission of a felony. Those factors met Tennessee's legal standards for imposing the death penalty. When the jury deliberated, they did not waver. They determined that the brutality of the crime, the danger Nichols posed to society, and the risk of future violence justified a sentence of death. In that moment, Harold Wayne Nichols' life became a legal sentence, an existence reduced to a series of filings, appeals, and confined years. Death row is a peculiar place. It is neither entirely prison nor entirely waiting room. Years pass without the rhythms most people know: birthdays, milestones, changes in the world outside. For Nichols, the wait stretched into decades. Throughout the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, appeals filtered through courts. Given the seriousness of death sentences, Tennessee law and federal court procedure demanded exhaustive review. Yet time, in all its length, does not guarantee mercy. At one point, Nichols' attorneys reached an agreement with prosecutors that would have resulted in a resentencing, life in prison instead of death. But it was rejected by a judge, and the death sentence stood. Some people on death row become bitter. Others fall silent. Some seek solace in religion. Some seek meaning. Nichols' life during those years was marked by reflection and, according to some reports, spiritual engagement. Yet the legal status, condemned, never changed. For scheduled execution dates came and went. One delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic when Nichols had originally chosen electrocution. Another halted when Tennessee reviewed its previous lethal injection protocols. Each delay was a reminder that even in death, the process of law moves slowly. In March 2025, after Tennessee instituted a new lethal injection protocol using a single drug, pentobarbital, courts set execution dates for several condemned inmates, including Nichols. Despite legal challenges and arguments over the death penalty's morality and the state's methods, the governor declined to intervene or grant clemency. Nichols was set to face execution on December 11, 2025, at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. As that day approached, both sides of the capital punishment debate gathered strength. Opponents highlighted questions about the cruelty of execution protocols and the possibility of rehabilitation. Supporters argued that Nichols' crimes were among the most violent and destructive, causing irreversible harm to a victim, a family, and a community. None of the debates changed what had already been written in state law. On the morning of December 11, 2025, Harold Wayne Nichols was administered a lethal dose of pentobarbital. He had declined to choose between the electric chair and lethal injection, leaving the decision to default to the latter under Tennessee law. In his final words, Nichols acknowledged his crimes. He asked forgiveness from the people he had harmed, expressed love for his family, and said he was ready to go home, a phrase that carries a finality few of us ever face. By mid-morning, at approximately 10:39 a.m., Tennessee officials pronounced him dead. Across the room, behind observation chambers, the silence was a stark contrast to the violence that had defined the case 37 years earlier. For some, the execution marked justice finally served. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions about redemption, punishment, and whether decades of remorse should influence the end of a life. Nonetheless, the state of Tennessee had closed a chapter that began in a young woman's bedroom and ended under the scrutiny of centuries-old legal practices. The story of Harold Wayne Nichols is not simply about crime and punishment. It is a human narrative that stretches across decades. It confronts us with uncomfortable truths. How do we balance justice with mercy? How do we weigh decades of remorse against the brutality of violence? Can anyone ever truly pay back what they've taken from another? These are the questions that linger long after the last legal filing, long after the final injection. If you want more deep explorations of true crime that go beyond the surface and uncover the human consequences beneath the headlines, subscribe and stay with me for the next story. On December 19, 2025, inside Florida State Prison, the state of Florida carried out the execution of Frank Athen Walls by lethal injection. He was 66 years old. Nearly 4 decades had passed since the night that placed him on death row. Nearly 4 decades since 2 women were murdered inside their own home. By the time the drugs were administered, Walls had spent most of his adult life inside prison walls, existing in a space between memory and punishment. For some, his execution represented justice delayed but finally delivered. For others, it reopened questions about whether the death penalty can ever truly balance the weight of loss. But before Frank Walls became a condemned inmate, before he became a case number, before his name appeared on execution schedules, he was simply another man living an ordinary life. This is the story of how that ordinary life collapsed into one of the most brutal double murders in Florida history, and how the consequences followed him until the day he died. If you want deeply researched true crime stories that focus on facts, psychology behind the crimes, and real human cost, subscribe now. Frank Athen Walls was born and raised in Florida. He did not grow up in wealth. He did not grow up famous. He did not grow up expecting to become part of the state's death penalty system. Friends and acquaintances from his earlier years described him as socially capable but inconsistent. He drifted between jobs. He struggled with long-term stability. He had difficulty maintaining healthy relationships. Nothing about his outward life suggested that he would one day commit a double homicide. But patterns were forming beneath the surface. Walls struggled with impulse control. He harbored anger that he rarely expressed directly. He tended to internalize resentment rather than confront problems. This type of personality can appear quiet and functional, but internally pressure builds, and pressure, when left untreated, does not disappear. It transforms. Instead of seeking help or change, Walls increasingly blamed other people for his frustrations. He believed he had been mistreated, overlooked, shortchanged by life. That belief slowly became the foundation of his worldview. Once someone adopts that mindset, they begin to justify behavior that once would have seemed unthinkable. Juanita Pritchard lived in Stuart, Florida. She was a working mother. She maintained her household. She cared for her children. Her life revolved around everyday responsibilities. Her daughter, Monica Pritchard, was 19 years old. 19 is an age filled with transition. Old enough to imagine independence, young enough to still rely on family. Monica had friends, dreams, future plans. Neither woman was famous. Neither lived a high-profile life. They mattered because they were human. They mattered because they were loved. On February 27, 1987, both were alive inside their home. By the next day, both were dead. Their lives ended violently. Their futures ended completely. Frank Walls was not a stranger to the Pritchard household. He had been inside the home before. He was familiar to the family. That familiarity mattered, because familiarity creates access. Access creates opportunity. Walls knew when people were likely home. He knew the layout of the residence. He knew routines. At the same time, Walls' personal life was unraveling. He faced financial instability. He lacked direction. He felt powerless. Instead of addressing those feelings constructively, he internalized them. He began seeing other people not as individuals with their own lives, but as obstacles, as resources, as objects. This shift in perception is critical, because once a person stops seeing others as fully human, harming them becomes psychologically easier. Walls began to believe that he deserved something from the world, and when entitlement replaces empathy, violence becomes possible. On the night of February 27, 1987, Frank Walls entered the Pritchard home. What happened next unfolded in a deliberate sequence. Walls attacked Juanita Pritchard. She was beaten. She was strangled. She died inside her own home. After killing Juanita, Walls did not leave. He then confronted Monica Pritchard. She was sexually assaulted. After the assault, she was murdered. 2 separate victims. 2 separate killings. 2 separate choices. This distinction is important, because it demonstrates sustained intent. Walls had time between the attacks. Time to stop. Time to leave. Time to reconsider. He chose not to. After killing both victims, Walls attempted to conceal his actions. He cleaned himself, changed clothing, tried to remove evidence. These behaviors showed awareness. Awareness of wrongdoing. Awareness that he had committed crimes. The scene left behind was horrific. 2 bodies. Signs of struggle. Evidence of sexual assault. A home transformed into a crime scene. The bodies were discovered the following day. Police immediately recognized the scene as a double homicide. Investigators began identifying who had access to the home, who had contact with the victims, who had motive. Frank Walls quickly emerged as a suspect. Physical evidence linked him to the scene. Witness information placed him near the residence. Under questioning, Walls confessed. He admitted to killing Juanita Pritchard. He admitted to sexually assaulting and killing Monica Pritchard. His confession was supported by forensic evidence. The case against him was overwhelming. Walls was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, sexual battery. From that moment forward, his life was governed entirely by the criminal justice system. Walls went to trial in Florida State Court. Prosecutors presented a clear narrative. Walls entered the home, killed Juanita, sexually assaulted Monica, killed Monica. They emphasized aggravating factors. Multiple victims, sexual battery, murders committed inside a residence, heinous and cruel nature of the crimes. The defense did not deny that Walls committed the killings. Instead, they argued against imposing the death penalty. They presented information about his background, his emotional problems, his instability. They asked jurors to choose life imprisonment without parole. The jury rejected that request. Walls was found guilty on all charges. During the penalty phase, jurors weighed aggravating and mitigating factors. They recommended death. The judge imposed 2 death sentences. Frank Walls was sent to death row. Walls spent decades on Florida's death row. Life there followed rigid routine. Small cell, limited movement, minimal human contact. Years passed slowly. Walls watched other inmates receive execution dates. He watched some have sentences overturned. He watched others die. The outside world changed dramatically. Inside prison, time felt frozen. Walls remained defined by 1987. He aged. His hair grayed. His body weakened. But his legal status remained the same. Condemned. Walls' attorneys filed numerous appeals. They challenged jury instructions, evidence rulings, sentencing procedures. State courts reviewed the case. Federal courts reviewed the case. Each time, the conviction and sentence were upheld. No court found reversible error sufficient to overturn the death penalty. Eventually, Walls exhausted his legal options. The sentence remained intact. In 2025, Florida's governor signed Frank Walls' death warrant. An execution date was set for December 19, 2025. From that moment, execution was no longer theoretical. It was scheduled. Attorneys filed last-minute motions. Advocates requested clemency. None were successful. The execution moved forward. In his final days, Walls met with attorneys. He met with spiritual advisors. He spent long hours alone in his cell. He acknowledged responsibility for the murders. He did not claim innocence. There were no dramatic public statements. Just acceptance that the process had reached its end. On December 19, 2025, Frank Athen Walls was escorted into Florida's execution chamber. He was secured to a gurney. Intravenous lines were inserted. Witnesses observed through glass. Lethal injection began. Within minutes, Walls lost consciousness. Shortly afterward, he was pronounced dead. After nearly 38 years, the legal process ended. Not the pain, not the loss, but the case. The story of Frank Athen Walls is not about spectacle. It is about choices. Small ones, then larger ones, then irreversible ones. 2 people lost their lives. A family lost a mother and daughter. A community lost its sense of safety. A man lost his freedom, then his life. Nothing about this story represents victory. It represents human failure. It represents what happens when anger goes untreated, when resentment becomes identity, when responsibility is abandoned. If you stayed to the end, you now understand something important. True crime is not entertainment. It is a record of consequences. And understanding how violence begins is the first step toward preventing the next tragedy. If you want more factual, thoughtful true crime stories, subscribe.